Welcome back for another tutorial on the low vision proficiency. This tutorial is going to be over a visual acuity test called the MN-Read test. Now, this particular test is a way in which we can determine the appropriate amount of add that a patient needs in order to be able to read at near, or what kind of spectacle, reading glasses, or reading power that the patient needs. This test is more accurate than a Collenbrander near acuity chart. It's also more accurate than a Snellen reduced acuity or reduced Snellen visual acuity chart. The reason for this is because the patient is actually required to read small passages of text. So unlike the Collenbrander or reduced Snellen card, those particular charts have random letters that the patient has to read. Because of this, it's not the most accurate test for actual reading, or if the patient is interested in reading books or that sort of thing. So we have the MN-Read for this specific task. As part of this task, the clinician is required to explain the purpose of the test to the patient. So something along the lines of, this test will allow us to see how well you read, is totally fine for the clinician to say. The clinician needs to have the card set at the patient's reading glasses, at the focal point of their reading glasses prescription. So let's say, for instance, that the patient is wearing a 250 add. The clinician would need to set them at a very precise 40 centimeters for this test distance. Unlike the Collenbrander test that we did earlier, where we allow the patient to choose their own habitual reading distance and then measure that, for this one, we need to be fairly specific, because what we're trying to do is to see if we have the right amount of add for the patient, and if not, how much more do we need to give them? How many more diopters do we need to give them to help them see up close? Because of this, we need to be very precise in our reading distance. And so our reading distance needs to be at the working distance of the lens. Like I said, for instance, if you're giving them a 250, it needs to be at 40 centimeters, 33 centimeters for 3 diopter lens, and so on and so forth. So as part of this, the clinician should check and see what distance the card is at, have their tape measure out, measure this distance, and then prompt the patient to move the card closer to them or further away in order to achieve the appropriate working distance. For this particular test, the patient is going to be unoccluded, and so we're going to test both eyes at the same time. The clinician should give some instructions to the patient on how to conduct the test. And so they need to say something along the lines of, in a few moments, I'm going to have you start reading this line of text at the top. I want you to read each sentence as fast and as accurately as you can. But if there's a word that you don't know, it's okay to skip it. It's also important to encourage the patient to guess and to, again, read each line as quickly as they can. So those would be very appropriate instructions for the patient. The other thing the clinician could say is, when you get to the end of the line, please stop and don't read ahead until I tell you to go. So as the patient is reading the sentences, the clinician is timing and seeing how long it takes for them to read each passage. So that's the reason why we ask the patient to stop in between each passage. And it gives the clinician time to stop their stopwatch, record the time, and reset it and be ready for the next sentence. For the room setup for this particular test, we should have full room illumination, meaning that the room light should be on, and we should also have the stand lamp directed at the card and positioned such that it doesn't provide or doesn't cause a lot of glare going back into the patient's face. It should be something that the clinician checks periodically, perhaps when they flip the card over, rechecks the working distance and makes sure that the patient is maintaining the same distance. And it's also okay for the clinician to tell the patient, if they see the patient moving the card closer to them, to stop them and say, hold on, let's move the card back out to the correct distance, and then we can start the test again. As mentioned before, the clinician is going to be timing each sentence with a stopwatch of some sort. It's okay if they use a wristwatch or their phone, but they should do something that keeps accurate time and not just count or just wing it as far as finding when the patient starts to slow down. And I'll explain more about that when we talk about how we grade this particular test. The other thing is looking for the endpoint. So the patient should be able to read a little ways down the card. I like to see them get 1 or 2 sentences onto the back side of the card, which would be the 4M or 3.2 M size print. And I'll show you that here shortly. As they're reading, the clinician can make notes about words that are missed or that sort of thing, but these don't really factor into the overall calculations for the test. The last thing that the clinician is going to do after the test is conducted is record this information in Revolution, and I'll show you how to do that here in a second. But first, let me share my screen and show you what the M&Read test looks like. So let me zoom in just a little bit here, and you can see the cards themselves right here. And so here on the left, we have the front part of the card, which starts off with 8M. And then here on the back, you can see the card again. It's the same card, it's just flipped over, and it starts with 4M at the top. So here's how the test should go. I'll be both clinician and patient for this particular example. So the clinician tells the patient, in just a moment, I'm going to have you read this top line of text. It's important for you to try to read it as quickly and accurately as you can. If there's a word that you don't know, that's okay, just skip over it. I'm going to be timing you, and so whenever you get to the end of this passage, I want you to stop and wait for me to tell you to read on. So the clinician gives the card to the patient, checks the working distance, makes sure that they're set at the proper distance, and then says, okay, on your mark, get set, go. And the patient will read, my father takes me to school every day in his big green car. And as I timed that, that took me 3.7 seconds to read. And so the clinician needs to record that somewhere on their recording sheet. And so they could say 3.7 here, for instance. It's much easier to write than it is to use this mouse. So now I'm going to run my stopwatch here. So let me reset things. The clinician says, okay, move on to that second sentence. On your mark, get set, go. Everyone wanted to go outside when the rain finally stopped. So that was about the same. So you'd write 3.8 here. Reset your stopwatch, and the clinician will say, on your mark, get set, third sentence now, ready, go. They were not able to finish playing the game before dinner. Okay, again, about the same time. So 3.7 again. At this point, the clinician will need to flip the card over for the patient so that they can see the smaller optotypes on the back. It's probably a good idea for the clinician to go ahead and remeasure this distance just to make sure that the patient is maintaining that working distance that's appropriate for their ad. Patient's all set up. We recheck the working distance. Clinician tells the patient, okay, on your mark, get set, read that top line for me, and go. My father asked me to help the 2 men carry the box inside. Okay, patient's still doing well. So we're writing 3.7 here, and rounding to the nearest tenth is totally appropriate for these. They don't need to get super specific, 3.75 or 7.4 or something like that. Just rounding to the 10th is totally fine. Clinician would say, all right, we're going to move on to that next sentence. On your mark, get set, go. 3 of my friends had never been to a circus before today. So same thing, about 3.8 seconds here. And now we're moving on here to this one. All right. Clinician tells the patient, move on to that next line. On your mark, get set, go. My grandfather has a large garden with fruits and vegetables. Okay. That one was about 3.9. And this just repeats until we reach a point where the patient is having a hard time actually reading the letters. And so let me show you what that looks like. So we're getting down to this 2.0 M. We're going to read this sentence here. And now I'm going to pretend to slow down just a little bit. He told a long story about ducks before his son went to bed. So in this case, it took me about 6 seconds to perform that test. All right, so we're starting to slow down a little bit. We see that the patient is struggling a little bit in order to read these sentences. And now we're kind of getting to the point where we know we're getting ready to reach what's known as our minimum size, or kind of getting to the threshold. So let me reset my stopwatch. We're going to read the 1.6 M now. And we tell the patient, on your mark, get set, go. My mother loves to hear the young girls sing in the morning. Okay. So in that instance, that's a big drop off. That took around 14 seconds to read. Okay. So the clinician will have this card available to them. They'll have this chart available to them, of course, to conduct the test. Once they finish with this, what they're needing to do is determine what's called the critical print size. The critical print size is the last optotype size where the patient was able to maintain their average. So if we look across over here, we could see that I was able to see read the first paragraph in 3.7 seconds. And then I was at 3.8, 3.7, 3.7, 3.8, 3.9. And then we start to drop off to 6 and then 14. So I would likely say that 2.5 M is my last average reading speed, or the point at which I was able to maintain my last reading speed. Now, if the clinician wants something that's totally fine for them to do, is to come down here. If they need to visualize it, they can use this and go, okay, 3.7 seconds is here, 3.8 is here, 3.7, 3.7, 3.8, 3.9, and then 6 and 14. What we're looking for, and what the clinician should be looking for, is an overall trend line. So for instance, you can see the patient is coming along pretty good, and then drops off again. And so what we're looking at is, this is the optotype at which they were able to maintain their average reading speed. So what we can effectively do is say, this optotype is their maximum visual acuity with this add. And by doing this, we're able to say, okay, well, if they're only able to see 2.5 M with the add that we gave them, what kind of add would we have to get them or give them to get them down to 1.0 M? And it's in this method that we're able to determine the add power that we need to give the patient to make it where they can read 1.0 M. So let's go ahead and work through the math here, since we're on this right now, and we'll come back and talk about this a little bit more later. Now, the reason that it's very important for us to know the test distance is because that's going to influence our calculations for what kind of add the patient is going to use. There are multiple methods in order for us to determine the add power that we need for the patient to see 1 M. The easiest one that I like to use is just to invert the visual acuity fraction. So sort of like with Collenbrander, if the patient was at 40 centimeters, you could sort of record this as 0.40 over 2.5 M. So that would kind of be their reading acuity with this particular test. All right. Now, in order to determine what kind of add power that we would need to give the patient, which is something that their student is required to do on the proficiency, all we're going to do is flip this equation, or flip this visual acuity fraction. And so we would say 2.5, we can leave off the M just for these testing purposes, over 0.4. So let me use my calculator here, which is totally fine for the student to do. 2.5 divided by 0.4 is equal to 6.25. What this means is that we would need to give the patient a plus 6.25 lens for them to be able to see 1.0 M print, according to this calculation, or this estimation here. On the grading slip or the rubric, it asks the patient to give them a reserve of 20%. And so the patient should know to do this. I'm sorry, the clinician should know to do this. But let me add the 20% here, and we end up with a plus 7.5 add. Okay. The 20%, for the purposes of grading this test, it's not necessarily important that you know exactly where this comes from. But a lot of research has been done and has found that 20%, a 20% reserve is typically adequate for this specific test. So this is just one example. But the easiest way to do this again is to just invert the fraction, and that will give you the adders that the patient is supposed to have. If there are multiple places for the students to make errors while conducting this particular test, for instance, let's say that they don't measure at all at the beginning of the test, that's going to affect the entire test. So that's going to affect the entire Emin-Read test. And in that instance, as the proctor, you'll have to kind of make a judgment call into how much you're wanting to take off points further down in the exam, because technically everything hinges on getting that distance right. However, if they don't measure it, but they do everything else correctly, you may feel like, well, had they measured, they would have gotten this right, and you may want to give them full points. But that's up to you as the proctor to decide. And if you have specific questions about that, you can ask myself or Dr. Ma about, how we should grade this particular test. Let's say, for instance, we're going to use this critical print size again here because it's already written down. It's very easy for us to see what's going on here. But let me erase this real quick. Okay. Now let's say that we used a 3 diopter add. And so in this case, our visual acuity fraction would be 0.33 over 2.5 M. So again, to find the right add for this patient, we would need to just flip this over. So we would say 2.5 divided by 0.33. And that should be 2.5 times 3. Or about 7.57. What this would indicate is that they would need roughly 7.5 diopters to see 1M. Now, if we add 20%, we're going to end up somewhere around 9 diopters. And so that's with the 20% reserve for this particular test. That is something that the patient, that is something that the clinician is required to tell you. Let me show you quickly here where this information is put in the Revolution chart. So in this particular case, everything else that we've done is here on the first pod, the first tab here. But for Emin-Read testing, they should click into the low vision visual testing and the low vision refraction. And then right down here is where they would record this information. So let's go back and look here. And let's just record this right here. So in this case, they would say 0.33 over 2.5 M. And they might look and see if it's available in the drop down here. In this case, it is, except for that. So I would probably prompt them to write like this, because leaving that one blank here and then just putting something like the optotype size can be quite confusing. So we could put Emin-Read here and then habitual or trial frame, whatever the refractive condition is there. In this case, because we're asking them to tell us what the add is that the patient would need, they could put something in here like And so they could tell us the exact dioptric amount here. And then write with 20%. .09 diopters. So if the clinician rounds it off and they say 7.5 diopters and 9 diopters, that's totally fine. If they want to keep it this precise, that's also okay. But they should record it in this method somehow. If they felt like they needed to, they could even write, 0.33 over 2.5 M, something like CPS, standing for critical print size. And then this could be showing their work for the 20%. And then just click save there. This by far is one of the more difficult tests to conduct, and therefore is the most technical for the students. And so in this case, you need to be judging if you felt like they did it in a competent manner, if they were professional, if they were able to get the test completed within the 10-minute allotted time. All those things would feed into their overall competency score. But as always, you are the proctor. You get to make the final decision. If you have any questions or concerns, you can always talk to myself or Dr. Ma. As always, if there are questions over any of the other rubric points for this particular test, please let me know. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next video.